So with that, let's get into the specific content for today. The topic today is community defense, how neighbors can protect their community. We will be using information from the case study, the Schmidt family case study. We introduced the Schmidts 2 webinars ago. I will not do that again. You will be able to provide or find all the information about the case study itself inside of the Defense Academy. But I would like to just briefly summarize that within the Schmidt case study, what we did was to take a composite set of events and activities that some of us at Pulse have been involved with, involving the city of Detroit and our experience from the standpoint of living there, offering businesses there, and from the standpoint of the history of Detroit and what's currently happening. So what we wanted to do is construct a case study that would allow us to take a look at current events in real time and use something that has some basis in reality. The case study itself has a very detailed set of resources that accompany it, including a complete backstory on the family itself as far as the current situation, the story of their business, which is called Auto Parts Distributors. There is a security briefing in there that shows you how to put together a security briefing for a business, a site survey, a mission essential task list, a wargaming example, and then an after-action report. So all of these are resources that you will find very important from the standpoint of defending a business, a church, school, and most importantly, a community. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill Talon. Bill and Ron will do most of the heavy lifting today. Bill is going to get into the historical event and the hypothetical scenario. With that, I'm going to hand over control to Bill so that he will be able to present off of his slide deck. And let's see, Bill, you should be good to go there.
Do you see my screen?
And I can hear you and I can see your screen.
Very good. All right, welcome everyone. I'm going to talk some theory and concepts for a little bit here regarding community defense. It's a very interesting topic. To even raise this question of how neighbors can protect their community is to admit that we're in a period of civilizational decline or decay. Folks like most of us here, adults in American society today, all grew up trusting in an implicit social contract, which gave our wealth through taxation and control through mechanisms of law to the state in return for the state's promises of safety, security, and justice. But unfortunately now, from the inner cities to the hinterland to the setting we've watched all year of political rallies last year and this year, and of course the worsening climate of international security. The ability of the state today to make good on that commitment is eroding rapidly. Now that said, understand we are in no way anti-government. We love the rule of law as we once knew it, but what we feel we have to do as members of a society is fill the gaps that are widening daily. We've spoken here in earlier webinars about the logic and methods of threat assessment. That's an important foundation to all of our discussions. Threat assessments have to be local and specific. The problems and the solutions that we speak of cannot be generalized. There's such a wide variety of physical and social settings in modern America that threat assessments have to be performed locally and updated regularly. But we would contend that denying the environment of emerging threats is not a viable option. We must pay attention. We provided examples previously, both on the historical side and hypothetical, of how individuals and families and businesses, churches and schools can address these evolving threats through individual self-reliance and collective action as teams. But here today, we're taking this a big step farther on. We're looking at a situation where social cohesion and social trust no longer suffice, where the state's police and judicial powers are stretched very thin and are increasingly ineffective. And this is an environment where neighbors must learn to work together. Neighbors and communities must fill those gaps in their own security. Okay, principles. Underlying all of the following principles and concepts is the assumption, again, that you will base your efforts on a threat assessment, an area study, an assessment of vulnerabilities, strengths, and assets that are comprehensive, realistic, locally and specifically accurate, and updated as conditions and capabilities change. As Ron will point out later in this presentation, guidance and examples of all of these concepts are provided throughout our training manuals, and we'll discuss some of them in more specifics right here in this presentation. All right, first principle for community defense is to upgrade physical security. Physical security provides deterrence, detection, and delay of pretty much the full spectrum of potential threats in our modern society. It buys time for us to build situational awareness, to understand what's going on, to communicate, and to react appropriately. Physical security alone will almost never be enough to defeat a determined adversary. As the tactical axiom says, no obstacle is effective unless it's covered by fire. And we're not talking necessarily about that kinetic threat right now, but physical security and barriers is only partially effective. But what we do find in our situation, we're looking primarily at threats in the family of thieves and home invaders and flash mobs and rioters and other expressions of civil disorder and lawlessness. Time and technical resources are not usually in great supply, and sometimes physical security can be enough. Historical examples abound. Okay, medieval towns and abbeys back in the early Middle Ages were never enough to stop raiders or attackers, but it slowed them down so the defenders could gather, organize, and repel the assault. Right? Smaller bands that could not overcome physical security would simply seek easier targets elsewhere. In practice, what physical security means is that you as a community will provide standards, advice, encouragement, and assistance to your neighbors, whether families in their homes or institutions, that will allow them to harden up their premises or be prepared to do so in a crisis or when threat levels increase. It also means a close look at avenues of approach and egress to your community in general. In times of heightened tension, can these routes be closed, controlled, or at least observed to provide early warning? Okay, second principle, community observers. A community has to develop a system of observation, reporting, and alert that depends upon citizen volunteers. A system implies training and organization and planning, as well as communications means and procedures. The nature of your community, the level of commitment and involvement of citizens, and your spectrum of potential threats will shape your answers to these questions. Who's watching? What are they watching for? To whom do they report? These will be community members going about their daily business but alert to what is going on around them, prepared to call in reports when they observe something suspicious or out of place. These community observers should be educated by your organization to understand the spectrum of potential threats, to identify precursors or indicators of trouble. Almost all of us need training and encouragement to avoid the traps of complacency and normalcy bias. That means finding and sustaining the moral courage to report a suspicious event or observation rather than dismissing it, even when the event or the incident or the condition that you see does not constitute a violation of law or a direct threat against anyone's safety. Observers need to be willing to sound a false alarm, because if their alarm turns out to be unfounded and not actionable, they will contend with embarrassment, and embarrassment is a small price to pay for vigilance, and is in everyone's interest. Reporting by citizen observers, therefore, must be easy and consequence-free. Errors in the sense of false alarms should be tolerated, in fact, should be encouraged. Citizen observers, community observers will rely in normal times primarily upon phone contact with a communications plan for backup if conditions deteriorate. The acronym PACE refers to primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency means of communications. We'll speak of this a little more with examples later on. All right, the third principle is community patrols. These will be community member volunteers who patrol on foot or by vehicle in order to detect, monitor, and report suspicious or threatening activities. This is definitely a more dynamic and proactive role than the static observation that observers provide. It will have a considerable deterrent effect. Whether these patrols would operate as in single individuals or in pairs, their overall numbers, and their hours of operation will depend entirely upon the specific threat environment and a number of other specific factors. When patrols observe suspicious or threatening activities, or are notified of them, they establish and maintain visual contact, investigate to the extent possible without compromising their own safety or worsening the situation, and they help the operations center and leadership cadre build an estimate of the situation. In the best of times, they will serve as eyes and ears for law enforcement and should be prepared to cooperate closely with them. In the event of a general or a specific alert, community patrols may be augmented by additional personnel, and they can assist with the dissemination of alert messages through personal contact. They can provide direction, escort, and assistance in the event of evacuation or consolidation of community members, and they will be the eyes and ears on the ground of the operations center and the community security cadre as a whole. They will have the same rights of self-defense as any citizen, but they must clearly understand that under normal conditions, they have no more authority than any other citizen to enforce the law, to command others' behavior, or to intervene in a violent or threatening situation. The Operations Center. We intentionally do not call this an emergency operations center for two reasons, as you see. One is that the EOC, or Emergency Operations Center, is a common appellation in government agencies and in corporate environments, and we don't want to conflate our community defense concept with that. And we don't want to imply that it will be active only during an emergency. We could call it a command post, but we felt that that might be a little ambitious because you in your community, in your neighborhood, have to be your own judge as to whether such an entity will actually have and implement command authority, or we're recognizing the realities in most communities and emergent security situations. You may find yourself herding cats just as much as commanding an organization. The purpose of the Operations Center is to receive calls and notifications from community observers and patrols, to request law enforcement and other outside assistance, and to coordinate response actions within the community. So as with any other headquarters or command and control center, our Operations Center would need to be in a secure location, have redundant communications such as radio nets, landlines, cellular, and satellite phones, and any other contingency or emergency means of signaling that you decide to implement. It would be manned around the clock during times of unrest or threat. and it will serve as a clearinghouse for information and a relay point for critical communications. The Operations Center should have a clearly defined protocol for transmitting critical information to identified community leaders and security cadre, and for initiating a general alert. It would create, maintain, and utilize a telephone calling tree with email and social media backup to disseminate information and alerts throughout the community, and again, would have a PACE plan to fall back on when normal communications fail or are compromised. A safety bulletin providing best available current and forecast information on potential threats should be disseminated at least daily to all subscribers, again relying on some combination of social media, email, texting, or pre-recorded phone messages. The next principle is protected locales. This is a principle, a concept that's based on two assumptions. One is that common law and statutes in most jurisdictions recognize your right to defend yourself on your own property, but not as armed groups in public settings. And secondly, some people in your community will not be capable of effective self-defense, and some properties will not be defensible. Therefore, you should seek to identify locations, and they may be homes or businesses, churches, schools, other community buildings, that can be protected against the various threats that you envision, and they should be designated as sanctuaries or rallying points for others. These protected locales are the modern equivalent of the medieval castle where people gather in a protected environment under threat. Depending on the size and distribution of your population in your community, you may need several such protected locales. Each one should be selected and prepared according to several criteria. It should be a structure that can shelter the expected number of people, which means a well-built structure with doors and windows that can be secured. Buildings with extensive glass on the ground floor, or light construction, or doors and windows that can't be made reasonably secure against breaking and entering. They're not suitable. Bullet resistance and fire resistance are desirable qualities applying masonry construction, but this may not always be available. A field of view, allowing occupants to see potential threats before they're on the doorstep, would be another desirable feature. The owner or custodian of any such suitable structure must be committed to the community defense enterprise and willing to open its doors to community members and to security cadre in the event of a threat. A protected locale should have a reasonable stockpile of food, water, and other essentials, such as medical supplies. Sanitary facilities are vital, and alternative lighting and heating may be important in the event of a protracted crisis. As we mentioned earlier, there's a tactical axiom that an obstacle is worthless or provides only minor delay unless it is covered by fire. In our context, if the threat includes human adversaries of any sort, passive structural barriers are probably not going to be enough, just as lockdown is only part of the solution in an active shooter scenario. You'll need defenders, appropriately armed, trained, organized, and disciplined. They might be associated with the premises, owners or tenants or employees, or they may have to respond to that location from elsewhere. How many, how armed, how organized, trained, and led they will be up to you and your organization, should not be left to chance or improvisation. Sixth principle, consolidation under threat. Community members should know the location of the nearest protected locale and be prepared to gather there, given sufficient advance warning. And they should have a willingness to abandon their own premises until the threat abates. This is going to be socially and psychologically difficult. It will only be feasible if community members are mentally, emotionally, and physically prepared to abandon property that cannot be protected, or alternatively to host others on their own property. This can be a challenging concept for lots of Americans. We've all been raised and socially conditioned to consider our home as our castle, and to resist the suggestion that we should abandon it under threat. but in modern America, this may be a practical necessity. Seventh principle, reaction teams. Your defensive capabilities are going to be far greater if with some form of mobile reaction force than if you have to depend only on a network of nodes of defended points that cannot offer mutual support. Now, whether in fact you can organize and train teams to conduct armed response to threats, acting outside the boundaries of private property will be entirely dependent on how you address the sensitive legal issues of operating as an armed group in a public setting. Statutes differ and perceptions differ, but you will have to approach this with great discretion and restraint. Some teams might operate with the knowledge and sanction of your local law enforcement agencies, or through the mechanism of a private security company, or under a worst case assumption that the rule of law will be so compromised by the time the need arises that you'll be willing to ignore the legal ramifications. How will you organize larger units from the basic building blocks of trained individuals, micro teams, and fire teams? And can you ensure that they will train together often enough to work together in a crisis? How will you notify and assemble them? Here are several aspects you'll have to address. The first, regulation. And we use that term in the same sense as in the Second Amendment, which speaks of a well-regulated militia. You should probably avoid calling yourselves a militia, which has become a politically charged term, but there's much in the history of citizen militias that is applicable here. If your security cadre is composed of volunteers, then you as an organization must be confident that they will answer a call up for staying home to protect their family. You must be confident that they will consider the larger community as much their responsibility as their own street or neighborhood. This is a huge issue. Your task is to build what amounts to kin, clan, and tribal loyalties among people who are related only by choice and by free will. To digress a little bit, there are very cautionary examples in our own history. In colonial New England, right through the American Revolution, there were recurring and nearly fatal incidents that were never really resolved until the early 1900s in the constitution of the National Guard. Early militias often saw themselves as local defense forces, and they refused to march beyond the boundaries of their colony or state, or even to mobilize unless their own township, county, colony, or state were under direct threat. The army that George Washington assumed command of in 1776 was composed largely of Massachusetts militia that considered their job done when the British evacuated Boston. When Washington marched his army to New York, thousands of those Massachusetts militiamen simply went home. And while a few later enlisted as Continental soldiers, most never took arms again outside of Massachusetts. This is a process and a set of attitudes that you will have to address in the context of community defense. Will community members willingly serve only alongside their own relatives and friends in direct defense of their own property and neighborhood? Or will they serve as willingly with or under the command of fellow citizens that they may not know so well in support of a larger community when that could pull them away from their own homes and families? Additionally, there will be those that are capable of effective self-defense in a static position, but who lack the physical ability to maneuver in a threat environment. There will be others who are young and fit, but unwilling to step beyond boundaries that they set for themselves. There's a place for people at all points on this spectrum of willingness and ability, but reaction teams in particular should be carefully selected and formed. You must be able to rely on them to respond when necessary. Further, command, control, and communications. There is a big difference between leading a small team in a tactical environment and having the ability to think several steps ahead, coordinate the actions of several teams, and balance conflicting priorities when much of the action is occurring beyond the range of your senses or your direct control. That is a leadership challenge of an entirely higher order. Leaders who can do this by virtue of prior training and experience are worth their weight in gold, and you must identify them, recruit them, and utilize them. Mutual support is an issue you must address. Security elements at protected locales, community patrols who may still be at large in the community as a threat develops. Reaction teams of any size and composition must all have the ability to recognize when they can support one another and cooperate, and they must have the means and the training in order to do so effectively, using, in most cases, the concept of implicit communications, because we expect that technology will fail. Reaction teams must attempt to minimize their exposure, because it is difficult to envision a community defense organization that will have excess manpower or that will tolerate casualties without a very deep and immediate effect on their morale. Missions assigned and techniques of movement should minimize exposure both to active threats and to agents of the government who may misidentify your operators as enemies rather than enforcers of public order. And that leads us right into the consideration of identification, friend and foe. If any form of hostilities or violence are underway, the danger of fratricide, of friendly fire, of blue-on-blue engagements will be extremely high, especially if you have patrols or reaction teams moving about in the same operating space as the threat, while other security elements are guarding fixed positions. Communications, coordination, and marking of friendly positions and personnel are extremely important. You must maintain a reserve. Regardless of the number and seriousness of the threats you face, and regardless of the limited manpower available to you, you must, at this level of tactical operations, maintain an uncommitted, centrally located reserve with which to respond to the unexpected. When, in your historical studies, you come across references to a commander committing his last reserves, you should understand that he was either foolish or at the absolute end of his resources and acting in desperation. Do not overextend. Know your capabilities and do not commit limited and precious assets to tasks that they cannot achieve. When you have more tasks than you have teams, it's time to pull back, consolidate, and balance your assets against your responsibilities and commitments. From Sun Tzu to Frederick the Great, we are reminded again and again and again that he who defends everywhere defends nowhere. Now, let's back out of that theoretical construct for a moment. We'll talk about a historical example, historical context that may bring these requirements into focus a little bit. We'll leverage our preparations, our actions on what we observe elsewhere. We'll learn from others' experience. So we're going to take a look at Sweden today. Sweden is, or has been, a prosperous, progressive first world nation. Once very socially and culturally homogeneous, Sweden's been a target for immigration from Muslim nations since the mid-1970s. The trickle became a flood in the latter half of last year, when 190,000 refugees or migrants arrived. Those 190,000 constituted 2% of Sweden's total population, which is less than 10 million. This would be equivalent to 6.4 million arrivals in the United States in the same 6-month period. With this immigration has come an explosion in violent crime rates, once largely confined to cities like Malmo, which absorbed much of the earlier influx. Okay, but now that immigration impact is being felt in small towns and villages across the country, where the government is now settling refugees in what they call asylum houses and threatening to expropriate private property to house even more of them. Since the era of officially sanctioned mass immigration began in 1975, violent crime in Sweden has increased by 300%. The incidence of rape has increased by 1,472%. Sweden is now surpassed globally only by the tribal homeland of Lesotho in South Africa in the number of rapes per 100,000 population. Coupled to this explosion in crime has been, just in the last year, a severe cutback in police services. Police stations have closed. Their officers have been consolidated in regional centers from which their response time, when they respond at all, is now measured frequently in hours. By late 2014, which again was before the massive refugee flow in late 2015 began, Swedish police officially reported that they had ceased operating in 55 no-go zones across the country, ceding control of those areas to criminal gangs. These zones mostly coincide with the 186 exclusion area ghettos that are populated primarily by recent Muslim immigrants. Prior to this, mailmen, firefighters, and ambulance crews had frequently been attacked when they entered those areas, and they all demanded police protection to enter them. When the police themselves started routinely coming under attack, they simply stopped entering those areas at all. Those areas are now ruled by clans, tribes, and criminal gangs without regard for Swedish law. Do we see the beginnings of a similar situation in parts of America with the post-Ferguson, post-Baltimore anti-police campaign? How many areas in this country might become similarly ungovernable if current trends continue? Elsewhere in Sweden, there has been a continuing upsurge in violence against immigrants, including the burning of asylum houses and various forms of so-called vigilante action targeting immigrants. Police, when they are active at all, disproportionately target this native Swedish reaction. Violence on both sides of this cultural divide is symptomatic of a descent into anarchy, of a failure in the social contract, a failure of the state to provide safety and security for its citizens. So what does the educated population of a developed Western nation do under such conditions? Well, two things primarily. Interestingly enough, the Swedes, like many other Europeans in the last year or two, are arming themselves. The numbers of firearms permits is growing rapidly, and over 500,000 people in a country of less than 10 million now own almost 2 million firearms, which doesn't seem like much from the American perspective, but those are significant numbers for a modern European country long committed to strict gun control and nanny-state socialism. Secondly, they form private defense networks. One Swede, whose farm has been robbed 3 times by immigrants recently, asks, "Are the state and I now in agreement that our mutual contract is being renegotiated?" When she reported her last robbery, the police advised her that since their resources were all on loan to protect the asylum houses in nearby cities, they should contact a local vigilante group, their term. That group turned out simply to be a group of private business owners, a private defense network, that had formed in 2013 to patrol their own area after being robbed nearly every night. So, enough on Sweden. Sweden's future is in Sweden's hands. But we can see similar trends in America, and that's why we're having this discussion today. So now we're going to look at our case study of the Schmidt family and business in the Baker Ford neighborhood of Detroit. We're going to back out, gain a little altitude, and look at the situation there from the broader community perspective in an indeterminate near future time, after Fred Schmidt and his peers have made some progress in organizing their community for its own protection. All right, here's the Baker Ford neighborhood in Detroit. Detroit's long decline, despite the best efforts of many of its citizens, has led to a breakdown in social cohesion, worsening race relations, and a near absence of police activity in the inner city. This situation awaits only a spark. The ignition point, as we've discussed previously as an example in this webinar series, as in 1967 or 1968, the spark may come from outside the city or it may be local. The Baker Ford historical neighborhood has been an island of peace and order until now. Last night, a Baker Ford Protective Association community patrol member on foot witnessed a cargo van pulling into the driveway of a darkened home in the 200 block of Foxtrot Street, disgorging 4 men who quickly disappeared around the back of the house. Since there had been a series of burglaries and one armed home invasion in the area over the past week, he assumed he was seeing an unlawful entry. So, as the suspect disappeared from view, he moved down to the middle of the block across the street to get the tag number off the van, while he speed dialed 911 and his own operations center. As he retreated back up the street to find a more concealed vantage point, two of the suspects emerged from the front door of the house and gave chase, shouting threats and brandishing at him what appeared to be a knife and a crowbar. The citizen moved into a yard, put a low stone wall between himself and his pursuers, drew his legally concealed handgun, and ordered the suspects to stop. But they sped up, and as they vaulted the wall 10 yards in front of him, he opened fire, engaging each with 2 well-placed rounds. Both suspects fell to the ground wounded. 2 more suspects emerged from the house, took in the scene, jumped into their van, and fled east down Foxtrot. Somewhat surprisingly, given their recent history of a slow response to emergency calls, the Detroit Police Department and Emergency Medical Services arrived about 20 minutes after the shots were fired. 1 suspect was dead on the scene, and the other, who after being restrained with flex cuffs had received life-saving care from the watch member, was transported to the hospital where he remains in critical condition. The watch member was neither arrested nor charged. Word of the shooting spread rapidly through Baker Ford and adjacent neighborhoods. In the early afternoon of the day after the shooting, a crowd of protesters assembled at Martin Luther King Jr. Park, half a mile south, with speakers and signs complaining of vigilante justice and the unprovoked killing of an unarmed youth. As darkness fell, rather than disperse, the crowd grew, spilled out of the park, and flowed northward up 3rd Street. A few rocks flew, auto glass was broken, then a storefront, and then a Molotov cocktail set a parked car on fire. The crowd surged north. 3 gunshots were heard. 2 police cruisers that had been parked up the street monitoring the protest reversed, turned, and departed. Another pair of community patrol members who had been discreetly monitoring the protest from its beginning called their operations center with an update and warning. They estimated the crowd would reach the Baker Ford boundary at Foxtrot and 3rd Streets within 15 minutes. The operator in the operations center dialed 911 and got a recorded message that all circuits were busy. A direct call to the nearest police substation resulted in a harassed assurance that they were aware of the situation and would respond when units were available. Community leaders who had been on call since the last night's incident were contacted and reported quickly to the OC. Let's back up a little bit. Let's talk about this Baker Ford Protective Association. It is currently in its 3rd month of operation, with limited funding and limited but growing public support within the neighborhood. It's had only 1 incident to contend with, which by the way, you will find described in some detail in our unit training manual in the Pulse Defense Academy. An attempted gang shakedown of an area business over in the light industrial district, which was resolved well and peacefully, but it raised the Protective Association's visibility with both positive and negative consequences. The city administration is uncertain whether to treat them as a neighborhood watch or as a vigilante group. Police attitudes below the level of the politically appointed chief are generally, if cautiously, positive. They're unaccustomed to cooperation from citizens and badly overextended. Fellow citizens in surrounding neighborhoods are envious and uncertain. Why should this sort of private action be necessary in modern America? And what does it mean for those who are less well organized? And finally, of course, bad actors, from petty criminals to gangs and social justice agitators, are openly and vocally hostile. There's an operations center occupying a rented office on the 2nd floor of an older brick residence in the 200 block of Delta Street. It's staffed by association volunteers, currently 6 retirees who work as operators in 6-hour shifts around the clock. There's usually only 1 on duty at a time, except for the shift overlap, unless there are major scheduled public events or indications of a potential threat. The OC has become a popular place for association observers, volunteers, and activists to congregate, so it's not unusual to have additional people present. The remainder of the structure it occupies is rented to an assortment of small shops catering to the tourist trade in the historical district. The OC has a 4-line corded business telephone system, a cellular phone with a roof-mounted booster, and a charger bank with 10 GMRS radios, which are shared with community patrol members. The OC also has an emergency generator. The association's community patrol is comprised of volunteers, now numbering 35, who mostly operate in pairs. Last night's solo foot patrol was an anomaly. The association has restricted patrol membership to individuals who possess concealed carry permits and can document a minimum of 40 hours combative handgun training from a recognized provider. The association recommends, but cannot require, firearms carry for the sole and express purpose of self-defense. During weekday working hours, there are typically two-member community patrols active in Baker Fort, in radio and cell phone contact with the Ops Center, patrolling randomly at their own initiative. Other members are on a call roster. The Observer program has enlisted many local businesses and residences who are encouraged to obtain, at their own expense, compatible GMRS radios to operate on the OC and patrol frequency, and to contact the OC by phone or radio to report suspicious or criminal activity. The protected locale concept has proven controversial, as expected, and only a handful of businesses and resident families have so far signed on. The concept of area defense, or protecting the association's territory by controlling access, is problematic in an urban environment. Leaders and community patrol members have wargamed this problem, but are not confident that they have a solution in hand. Association officers, including Fred Schmidt as president, have committed to report to the Operations Center upon notification of an imminent or ongoing security incident. After last night's incident, they're all within 5 minutes of the OC, and they arrived there swiftly in response to the operator's call. The threat of mob violence is not unanticipated. In fact, it's one of the top-tier threats that emerged from the threat assessment process, most dangerous and not at all unlikely, considering the social climate across the city in recent months. Fred didn't sleep much last night, appreciating that the lethal encounter on Foxtrot Street was one of those conditions that changes the threat calculus immediately and significantly. The Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and Freddie Gray cases are not that old. Reconstruction in Ferguson and Baltimore is still in process, and the Black Lives Matter movement is active in Detroit. Fred's first order to the OC operator over the phone before he even arrives is to execute the group call to activate all community patrol members and to send an alert notification to all association subscribers by text and email. The community patrol has been organized into nominal 6-man squads for training purposes. Fred's first action on arrival at the OC is to contact the 6 squad leaders by cellular conference call. He orders 3 squad leaders to assemble their squads and move them to specific locations as shown on this diagram, 3rd, 4th, and 5th Street intersections with Foxtrot, in anticipation of the mob's arrival on the association's boundary. Once there, they're to use their own vehicles and any others that they can commandeer to construct roadblocks and physical barriers across specified roads and the adjacent properties leading into Baker Ford from the south. 2 of the remaining squads are to stand by 1 block north, in the middle of each block between the roadblocks, ready for movement east or west to block additional intersections, or to back up the established roadblocks, or to intercept foot movement through the properties along Foxtrot. The 6th squad is held at the OC in reserve. All community patrol members are cautioned to keep weapons concealed and reveal them only if directly threatened. Long guns, if available, are to be secured inside vehicles and retrieved only as a last resort. Calls from the OC to all residences and businesses on Foxtrot Avenue urge occupants to secure and vacate the buildings and move to a protected locale or other secure location north of Delta. Schools and businesses throughout Baker Ford are advised by phone to lock down until further notice. Mob approaches the roadblock on 3rd Street as predicted. They find that 3rd Street just north of the intersection is physically blocked by vehicles bumper to bumper, with other vehicles daisy-chained up driveways and across sidewalks to the homes east and west of the street. Behind the vehicles are a dozen men and women standing silently. Locals have reinforced the community patrol squad. No weapons are in sight, but handheld radios are. The evidence of organization and the implicit threat stops the leaderless mob. Strong language and a few bricks fly. Damage is limited to car windows and sheet metal. Smaller groups break off and move left and right on Foxtrot Avenue, but by the time they reach the middle of the block, they see similar roadblocks at the next intersections, and they recoil backward into the larger group, which is now perhaps 200 strong. One small band runs up a driveway and into a backyard, but as they approach the fence at the alleyway, the backup squad from Echo Avenue appears in the yard to the north. Verbal taunts are followed by a rush by 3 rioters toward one pair of defenders, who stand their ground behind a picket fence and draw concealed handguns as their assailants enter the alley 20 feet away. One of the pair issues a clear order, "Stop or I'll shoot," and the assailants stop, look left and right to see weapons in the hands of 4 more defenders who have taken cover behind structures and vehicles. The assailants show their hands and back slowly away until they reach the driveway leading back to the street they entered from, then run back to the security of the larger crowd, where the story quickly spreads. Not so easily cowed now that they have the security of numbers, a few members of the mob produce handguns and brandish them while insults and rocks continue to fly. From within 2 vehicles immediately behind the roadblock, magazine-fed semi-automatic rifles appear in the hands of defenders. In a muzzle-down, cross-body carry, they do not directly threaten anyone, but the implicit threat has just gone up a notch. Fred sends his reserve squad to the intersection of 3rd and Echo, 1 block north of the main confrontation, giving up direct control, but maintaining radio and phone contact. And that squad now has visual and verbal contact with 3 other squads and is prepared to move immediately to assist any of them on its own initiative. Over the next 30 minutes, the standoff continues. The mob remains, but increases in size only slowly. More people join its ranks, but others, sensing the potential for a very bad outcome, drift away to the south. On the other side, more and more Baker Ford residents appear. There is a growing risk of a loss of discipline and control, and Fred Schmidt leaves the OC coming directly to the scene, where he does his best to draw off the late arrivals and task them with supporting roles that will keep them away from the rioters. Unspoken but clear in his mind is how this incident, if it resolves well, will support growth and local support for the association. At about 45 minutes after the mob's appearance, sirens are heard approaching from several directions. The crowd begins to melt away. By time it's full dark, the challenge facing Baker Ford will have morphed into a truly wicked problem. But for now, no one has been hurt. Property damage is minimal, and there have been no arrests or confrontations with police. This may be, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, only the end of the beginning, but it might have been far worse. And there I will conclude our hypothetical scenario. And Mike, if you would turn control over to Ron.
Okay, hold on, Bill, and I will hand off to Ron here.
Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you, Ron, and you should have control.
Excellent, thank you. You guys see that all right?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Great introduction. Thank you, fellas. Appreciate it. And good historic context as well as the scenario, Bill. That was excellent. Thank you. So we come back down to taking a look again in what enables an effective response. And at this point, the answer should be familiar with everybody who's been listening to this. We have it up here on the slide, and it really boils down to effective planning and leadership. I'm going to leave that slide there, and just going to hit on a couple of key topics really quickly here. And that is, when we talk about that realistic planning that we're looking at based upon a threat assessment has been mentioned. What we're looking at here is considering those things that are local and specific. I'm not going to delve really deeply into this, but again, I want to show everyone that is listening what we have in the Defense Academy for you. I know that a lot of this intellectual material isn't quite that sexy, but what you do need to know is that it is in here. We're not hiding any steps from you. You're able to actually go in here, dig into the meat of this. For instance, the threat assessment we were just looking at there, how to do things like look at your environmental threats, characterizing your threats, grading your threats, your site surveys, etc. And then the Defense Academy in here goes much deeper as well. In the unit tactics manual, we get in here into leadership and planning. And again, I'm not trying to bore you with this stuff, but I want you to understand that we get very deep into this, and we're giving you really full access to this information that is solid information. It's provided with real-life scenarios that give you an idea how to apply this, as well as our fictional group, the Schmitz, and what they do to better prepare themselves. That's all outlined in the Defense Academy. And so I want you to get a good idea of everything that lays in here, the access you can take to it, etc. And at this point, I just want to take a real quick step back, because what we're departing from now is that individual training and getting into the unit tactics that in the past, where we were looking at the individual and the small teams. Now we're looking at the teams and the units, and it bears, again, a discussion on what gives you that success. And I'm just going to go over this real quick. When we look at this, if you kind of visualize it and customize it for your place, your facility, your place of work, the way this might model for yourself and your teams, what we get into then, again, are the individual tactics that is the underpinning for the team and the unit tactics. Again, the Defense Academy has a lot here for you. Here you can see the handgun drills in this content. You can also see we have shotgun drills and rifle drills as well. And when we're in here looking at these, they're all laid out basically the same way. You come in here, you'll get your discussion of what we're going to talk about. You'll get a quick introductory video, how that particular piece of the puzzle should look and fit together. Then we get into the detailed discussion on how these particular techniques work, and more importantly, why they work the way they work. So you can see that there again for the handgun. Then we get into the individual tactics, where we get into some rather deep stuff, like, for instance, the distance and spalling and what that might look like and what it is, how it would affect you if you're standing too close, the appropriate way to deal with these things when we start looking at our sphere of influence, that sphere of influence, how it relates to the individual operator, actually giving value to his team and his skills, abilities. And we also talk about the limitations of the individual. And then we give real concrete examples and demonstrations of why you always want to look at grouping up with people. And then we get into the team tactics and looking at how 2 men is great, 3 is even better in those micro teams, and then we can start squatting up. And now you can start to see this buildup of the ideas at this point that brought us here for effective teamwork within the teams, and shortly and potentially here in the units. Even though they only had a few months on the ground, they were prepared. They were able to come in. They were able to look at the assets they had on the ground, the new assets they were bringing all the time in to here, how to utilize those new assets in the